The night the wind took the roof off the carpenter's cabin, 4 men and 2 horses died in a single hour. It was the kind of cold that cracked fence posts, burst whiskey bottles, left too near the wall, and peeled skin from a man's fingers if he forgot to glove them before touching iron. And while half the valley clawed through snowdrifts to bury the bodies, the woman they used to laugh at was holding her baby close in a cabin so quiet and still she could hear his breath as steady as her own heartbeat. But none of them knew that yet. 3 months earlier, they'd been laughing at her. Her name was Esther Keene, 23, newly widowed, and 6 months pregnant when she rode into Grief Hollow behind the ox cart, carrying her dead husband's tools. A gust of mountain wind had flipped their wagon just 3 miles shy of the valley. Jacob Keene was killed instantly. The horse broke a leg, and Esther had walked the last stretch alone, dragging a splintered cart through knee-high frost, her hands raw, her belly low, her eyes not blinking once. When she reached the hollow, folks didn't know whether to pity her or call her cursed, but they didn't stop her from taking Jacob's claim, not out of kindness, but because no man thought she'd last the winter anyway. Grief Hollow was no town, just a smattering of shanties and log cabins carved along the timber line where the black pine began to thin. It sat in a deep notch of land where wind slid down off the peaks like invisible knives, and wolves crossed frozen creeks without leaving tracks. But it was rich in fir and spruce, and the sawmill ran all year, even in sleet. That's what drew Jacob there in the first place. Boards and wages. He'd lasted 2 weeks. Esther moved into a half-framed cabin Jacob never got to finish. The walls were knee-high on one side and barely shouldered the frost on the other. No roof, no stove, no floorboards, just stacked timber, a frostbitten cot, and his tools buried under a canvas tarp stiff with ice. The other men offered her a place to sleep, some for the night, some for longer, but she refused them all and began working before dawn the next day. That's when they started laughing. They laughed when she built double walls. Instead of raising the frame higher, she laid a second row of boards around the first, 4 inches apart. Every nail sunk with care, every join sealed with scrap wool or snow-packed mud. They said she was wasting timber, said she'd run short before the walls reached full height, but she kept at it. They laughed when she filled that narrow gap with dried moss, sawdust and horsehair like she was stuffing a pillow instead of raising a home. They said it would rot, that the bugs would take it, that no serious builder packed insulation into a wall like that. They laughed harder when she framed an interior wall 3 feet inside the outer one, shrinking her livable space down by half, turning a proper-sized cabin into a narrow-walled box, just big enough to sleep in sideways. "Gonna live in a coffin with a chimney," one man called it. "Baby's first tomb." But she didn't stop. They laughed when she laid flooring twice. First a rough board subfloor, then another layer of split timbers atop it, with old feed sacks packed between like quilts. They laughed when she dug down instead of up, building a small sunken hearth where the fire would sit below the main floor level, saying it was backward, saying the heat would sink. They laughed when she built a ceiling only 5 feet off the ground, nailed thick canvas above the rafters, and wedged more cloth into every joist like she was tucking in a child. And they laughed hardest when she lined every wall, not just inside but out, with more planks, extra boards, split thin, overlapping like scales, covering the already doubled walls with a third layer. No man in Grief Hollow had ever done that. They called her crazy. They said she was building a coffin within a coffin. They told her she'd suffocate that baby before it ever took its first breath. Still, she didn't stop. The baby came early, late October, before the river froze, but after the snow had already dusted the rooftops white. She gave birth alone in that half-lit box of a home, in a bed framed out of leftover crate wood, on a mattress stuffed with cattail fluff. No midwife, no neighbor, just an iron kettle of boiled water, a knife she'd already heated in the fire, and the silence of a cabin so tightly sealed you couldn't hear the wind even when it howled through the trees outside. They didn't laugh as much after that, not openly. They said she'd get herself killed come December, that no woman, let alone a newborn, could survive in a cabin with barely a window, barely a draft, that her fire would smoke them out, that frost would climb the inner walls like ivy, and the baby would choke on damp air. But the days passed, and the cold deepened, and she didn't die. She walked to the mill once a week to trade, mostly boiled roots, sometimes buttons or buckles pulled off Jacob's old shirts. She took no handouts, asked for nothing, and refused every offer of help, even when her fingers blistered from hauling wet logs, even when her coat froze stiff as bark, even when her baby's cries were so quiet they couldn't tell if it was joy or pain. She never explained her methods, just nodded when they said she'd never make it, then walked home into the fog. The first storm hit in November. 3 feet of snow, wind so loud it moaned through the trees like wolves dying slow. 3 cabins collapsed, 2 roofs roofs blew off. A horse froze standing up in its stall. Esther didn't show her face for 5 days. When she returned, it was only to fetch a basket of coal and drop off a small bundle of firewood no one asked for. Her cheeks were red, but not frostbitten, her eyes clear, her baby wrapped in a thick wool sling, pressed close to her chest and breathing. They stopped laughing altogether after that, but they still didn't ask what she'd done. By mid-December, it was colder than most men had ever seen. The mill shut down. The creek froze so solid a man could ride his horse across. The men huddled their families close, burned green pine that smoked their walls black, and hammered spare boards across windows that bled white frost like sweat. But Esther didn't come to trade anymore. Her chimney smoked twice a day. No more, no less, just steady, black puffs rising out of her square chimney and fading into the sky like breath from a sleeping mouth. The coldest night came just after the solstice. Temperature dropped so fast the snow turned to glass. You could hear it crack as it cooled. The wind snapped a dozen trees clean in half. Every cabin moaned like a ship about to sink. And that was the night the carpenter's roof tore off. Wind lifted it like a leaf, flung it into the creek where it shattered. They found his wife and daughters frozen in their beds by morning. The horses dead. The fire long out, and not a soul willing to admit they ever laughed at Esther Keene because her baby lived. They saw her the next day, carrying a pale bundle in her arms, not stiff, not blue, but yawning. The kind of yawn only warm babies make when their toes are still curled and their nose is still pink. And for the first time, the men of Grief Hollow stopped her, not to mock, not to scold, but to ask how. She didn't answer. She just smiled, said, "I used every board Jacob brought," and walked back into the trees. The second part of her story, however, the truth behind what she'd really built, began long before that coldest night, and not one of them yet understood the secret that lay within those extra boards. Snow had turned the valley into a graveyard of sound, where once hammers echoed and axes split frostbitten logs with clean cracks through the morning haze. There now hung only the hush of white weight pressing down on everything. Trees didn't creak, boots didn't crunch. The wind itself seemed careful not to make too much noise, as if some old, unseen presence were watching, listening, waiting for someone to make the wrong move. Grief Hollow had always lived under that kind of silence in winter, but that year, it felt worse, heavier, like the cold didn't just freeze your skin, it watched you from the dark corners between rafters and whispered doubts into your ear while you lay awake, praying your fire didn't die. And yet, in the center of that hush, sat the only cabin that looked as if it had been built by someone expecting to survive. Esther's cabin didn't groan under snow weight. Her rafters didn't pop at night. No frost traced her windows. No boards bowed inward. No smoke escaped through cracks or splinters. It sat squat and low, almost shy among the taller homes with their proud gables and porches and overhangs. It didn't boast. It didn't gleam with varnish. It didn't creak when you passed it. It looked, to the unknowing eye, like a shack that had already been abandoned. But they were all wrong about that. Inside that cabin, on the night the wind howled through Grief Hollow like a dying beast, Esther lay awake in complete silence, holding her son in the hollow of her arms. His name was Matthew. He was barely 10 weeks old, and while most cabins fought tooth and nail just to keep a single corner warm, hers breathed like a stone womb, quiet, consistent, and above all, alive with heat that didn't vanish the moment the fire died down. Her baby had not caught cold, not once. He never coughed, never whimpered in the night from drafts. He didn't sleep in a cradle near the fire. He slept beside her in a bed that remained warm long after the coals in her hearth turned black. What those men never knew, what they never even thought to ask, was that the miracle hadn't come from the fire at all. It had come from the walls, that double wall system they laughed at. It didn't just keep the wind out, it trapped the warmth of the day, what little there was, and held it like a tight-lidded jar. Even when the fire went out, the cabin's thick-bellied design gave back the heat it had stored. Her roof was pitched low not just to prevent collapse under snow, but to keep warm air from rising out of reach. She'd sealed every seam, tucked in cloth not for comfort but compression. There was no escape for warmth, no exit for comfort. The heat was kept prisoner, and her baby thrived in that cell. The third layer of exterior boards, tarred in parts and overhung like fish scales, kept sleet from touching the core wood. It meant the walls never froze. No creaking, no warping, no sap bleeding out in strange patterns. The boards stayed dry, and dry wood meant insulation. Esther didn't just build a home, she'd created a living barrier, a thermal trap that no man in the valley had ever imagined. Because none of them thought like a mother. None of them knew what it meant to build for someone too small to say what hurt. But her mind hadn't stopped with walls. When she laid her floor, she didn't level it flat. She built a slope, barely noticeable but intentional. The lowest part sat beneath the hearth, while the highest rose toward her sleeping area. It meant that heat from the hearth, sunken into the floor, drifted naturally upward toward her bed, pulled by its own hunger to fill the highest space. And between those double floors, packed with sawdust, sackcloth, and hair from a brushed mule's tail, she'd placed slats of split wood that flexed just enough to give under her steps without groaning, absorbing her tread, never passing it on. When she breathed in that cabin, the sound disappeared before it could hit the walls. It wasn't a house, it was a cocoon, but still, they whispered. They said she was a witch, that maybe she'd made a pact, that no natural cabin could stay warm in wind that cold, that maybe the baby wasn't entirely hers. They said it softer now, of course, more out of fear than ridicule. After the carpenter's wife froze to death, with her hand still gripping the quilts, after that old preacher found his canteen solid as a stone beside the fire, after a young boy went out to check a trap and was found the next day stiff as a rod, after all that, Esther's warm cabin began to feel less like a miracle and more like a threat to what the other men thought they understood. Then came the knocking. It was just after midnight, and the wind was out again. Not as fierce as the night the carpenter died, but wicked enough that any man with sense stayed inside. Esther had been dozing, her baby nestled tight beneath 2 blankets and her own thick forearm, when the sound cut through the cabin like a blade across canvas. 3 knocks, not urgent, not hard, but wrong, because her cabin had no path. She'd never shoveled one, had no walkway, no fence, no porch lamp, just bare white snow all the way around, and one narrow chimney that only smoked twice a day. No one had ever knocked before. She got up without waking Matthew. She moved slow, calm, not out of fear, but calculation. Every step was planned, every breath silent. She reached the door and didn't open it, not at first. She listened. No more knocks, just wind, but she felt it, not cold air, not a draft. She felt the difference in pressure, a wrongness behind the boards, like something was waiting not just to come in, but to be let in. She pressed her palm to the center of the door. It was warm. That told her enough. If the wind had been truly bitter, the boards would be icy even inside. But no, something out there was blocking the draft, standing close, too close. Then a voice, not loud, not panicked, just flat. A man's voice, older. "Mom?" She didn't answer. "It's Ethan Kerr, from the mill." She knew the name. A barrel-chested man with split knuckles and a limp. Always smelled like pine dust. Always loud. This voice was not loud. I need a place just till morning. My fire's out." She said nothing. Her hand went to the brace across the door, a simple wooden beam wedged into a carved hook. One motion could lift it. One breath could break the seal. She thought of her son, of the boards, of Jacob. She didn't move. "I got no heat. I got nowhere to go. Please," he said again. She still didn't answer. But now there was something else. Another sound. A second voice. Behind him. A child's. A girl. Coughing. Then words. "Mama says she's gonna die." That broke her. Esther undid the brace and opened the door. Just a crack. Enough to see him. Enough to see the girl in his arms, wrapped in a coat too thin for the storm. Her cheeks blue. Her lips shaking without sound. Esther didn't ask. She stepped back. He carried the girl in and didn't speak. Esther sealed the door behind him. The warmth didn't vanish, didn't shrink back or die. It held. It surrounded them like breath. The man sank to the floor, girl in his arms, shivering like he'd just dropped into summer heat. Esther brought a dry blanket, wrapped the child, fed the fire. She didn't ask how they'd come to be out there. She didn't ask where the mother was. She didn't ask why he waited until the worst hour, because she knew the answer. All of them waited until the last possible second to admit her walls might be warmer than their pride. By morning, the girl's color had returned. She sipped warm broth and whispered thank you without opening her eyes. The man didn't cry, but she saw the way his shoulders fell when the child coughed no more. He tried to leave without saying much, but Esther stopped him. "What happened to your fire?" she asked. He didn't meet her eyes. "Roof's fine, stove's fine, but the frost got into the walls, came through the seams, like breathing ice. You sit there long enough and feel it in your bones. Heat just leaves you," she nodded, "because the cabin don't want you to live in it. You made it like a coffin." He looked up then, confused. Esther tilted her head. "Cabins don't keep you alive. They bury you slow unless you build 'em to fight with you." He opened his mouth, but no words came. He left without another sound. By the end of that week, 6 more men came knocking, first alone, then with children, then with wives, all claiming it was just for the night, all pretending it wasn't the warmth they came for. But none of them left before dawn. Some returned with wood. One brought venison. A boy gave her a spool of waxed thread. They didn't say sorry. They just stayed near, and the cabin that had once been laughed at for its extra boards became the place every child pointed to when they said, "That's where the warm air comes from." They never called it a miracle out loud. Not in a place like Grief Hollow, where the men still use spit to thaw rifle triggers, and most women knew how to dig a shallow grave with their bare hands. Miracles were for Sunday readings and bedtime tales told in summer before a warm hearth. But what Esther Keene had done that winter could not be called ordinary, and as the cold deepened, and more families began to whisper about the baby that hadn't once caught chill, the silence that hung around her cabin turned from suspicion to reverence. But reverence had teeth, and one evening those teeth came knocking, not with kindness, not with need, but with accusation. It started with a man named Jarvis Silas, who had lost his 2 boys in the frost. His cabin was sound, his roof thick with bark and snow slab, his wife a good woman who kept their fire burning through the blackest hours. But that cold, it had a way of slipping in between things, between logs, between thoughts, between people. It took his youngest first, then the older boy 2 days later, even with the child bundled beside the stove, both gone before sunrise, both buried in a snowbank while the ground stayed too frozen to dig, and Jarvis had not cried. Not then. He cried 3 days later, though, when he passed Esther's cabin and saw smoke drifting steady from her chimney, saw her baby through the narrow window, sleeping like a swaddled lamb, and something broke in him then. Not the part that loved his sons. That was already gone. It was the part that hated himself for not having built what she had built, so he blamed her. He came that night with 2 others, men of standing, men who worked the mill and had pounded nails into every home in the hollow, men who thought they knew wood, who thought they knew winter. They didn't knock, they banged, shouted, "Esther Keene, open this door now!" Her baby stirred in the cradle. The fire still burned. The walls held. She opened it without flinching. Jarvis stood there, cheeks red from rage, not wind. "You hiding something?" he asked. She blinked. "What would I hide?" He pushed past her, uninvited, boots stomping in like a storm. The 2 men behind him followed. They scanned the room. Nothing fancy. A fire, a pot steaming lightly, a cradle near the bed, walls lined with thick cloth and wood. No food piled high, no hoarded coal, no stack of borrowed wood. "Where's the second stove?" one man asked. "There is none," she said. "Where? You keeping the oil?" "No way this heat's from kindling and moss." "You got something buried under the floor?" She said nothing. Jarvis stepped forward. His eyes searched her like he might find heat leaking from her body. "You burn in kerosene? That it? Got a line from the mill's oil drum?" She walked past him, lifted the pot from the fire and set it aside to keep it from boiling over. Then she said, "No man here ever asked what I was building. Now that you're cold, you want to know how I did it." "It's not right," the second man muttered. "A baby don't sleep through this weather without something unnatural at work." The word hung there. Unnatural. Esther didn't raise her voice. "I did what my husband taught me before he died. I did what I had to. While you were laying 1 wall, I laid 3. While you waited for spring, I sealed every crack I could find. I used wool, moss, pine dust, horsehair, and patience. I built not for comfort, but for breath. You built to be seen. I built to survive. You're saying it's our fault our children froze?" Jarvis stepped toward her, fury boiling up now. "Too close, too fast. I'm saying you mocked me when you had strength. And now you're here asking me to confess to something I didn't do, because you can't stand that a woman did better than you." His hand twitched, but something stopped him. Maybe it was the firelight reflecting off the stillness in her eyes. Or maybe it was the silence behind him, the sudden discomfort of the other 2 men who had come looking for guilt, but found a woman whose home didn't shake in the wind, whose child had warm color in his face, and whose walls made no sound under pressure. Jarvis stepped back. He didn't apologize. He didn't speak. He left, and the other 2 followed. They never returned, but they didn't have to. That night unlocked something in the hollow, a shift. It wasn't that people turned against her. Most didn't, but now they watched her differently, with distance, with unease. Even those who owed her warmth, those who had spent nights beside her hearth, now spoke softer around her, as if she had become not just a woman, but a warning. It wasn't Esther that frightened them. It was what she'd proven, that everything they'd done, every shortcut, every corner cut, every time they'd picked speed over sturdiness, every roof built tall and proud but brittle, that all of it had been the wrong way. And no man wants to face the truth that a widow, alone, had built something stronger, warmer, smarter, and more sacred than the houses raised by men with teams and crews. And then came the freeze. Not snow, not sleet, just cold, like a wall. It came down from the ridge like a second dusk, a blue shadow that stole breath from lungs and bent trees without breaking them. The creek disappeared beneath a sheet of ice so thick the sound of moving water vanished entirely, and with it went the light. The sun rose but didn't bring warmth. Days sat dim and grey, and inside each cabin the fires burned longer, the logs smoked thicker, and the desperation started creeping in like frost at the windows. One family lost their cow when the beast froze to death, standing beside a burning lantern. Another man broke his hand trying to chop wood so fast he missed the stump and split bone instead. Esther stayed inside. She left only once in those 5 days, to deliver a wrapped bundle of bread to the family whose boy had been sick since fall. She didn't knock. She just set it down and left. When they unwrapped it, the bread was still warm. That's when folks started whispering about the floor. Rumors had spread that Esther's warmth came not from fire nor wood, but something laid beneath her home, something Jacob had buried before he died, some secret layer, some trick. They imagined copper coils, oil drums, buried coals. Some even said the warmth came from the baby itself. Theories grew wild, fast, like weeds, until one man decided to find out for himself. His name was Red Doyle, a wiry, sunken-eyed trapper who lived 2 ridges over, whose own wife had died years back from pneumonia. He spoke little, but watched everything. That winter, he'd been trapped in his own home 3 days without a fire that would stay lit. His chimney had cracked, and his only remaining furs were damp. He knew death when it crouched beside a man, and it was beside him now. So he made the walk, 1/2 mile through sleet and silence. He didn't knock. He waited. Esther opened the door. "I don't need food," he said. "I don't need your fire." "Then why are you here?" she asked. "To see your floor." Her face didn't move. "Why?" "Because I got a niece who's got 2 weeks left, and if your floor saves her, I'll carry every board in this valley on my back till spring. But I need to understand it." Esther looked behind her. The baby slept. The coals in the hearth glowed low. "Take your boots off," she said. He stepped inside. She pointed to the seam between 2 boards near the hearth, bent down, pulled gently. The board lifted. Beneath it, not fire, not fuel, but layers, packed sawdust, moss, hair, bark, strips of cloth, even dried manure, flattened, cured, cut into squares, each layer spaced, each designed to catch warmth, to stop cold. A living quilt beneath the floor, and beneath that dry stone, sealed with tar, warmed from the coals above and held in place by nothing but gravity and care. She said only this: "Fire heats you once, layers heat you always." Red didn't speak. He just nodded. He left before dawn, and by noon, he'd torn up his own floor, laid layers like hers, and began teaching others how to do the same. That spring, when the snows melted and the trees began to show needles again, more than half the cabins in Grief Hollow had rebuilt their floors. Not higher, not fancier, but thicker, smarter, like hers. And Esther? She said nothing. She held her baby close, and one night, as he suckled quietly, she ran her hand along the wall beside her bed, the wall made of extra boards, the one Jacob had left her enough timber to finish before he died, and whispered, "You were right, they needed more than just shelter." By the time the first true thaw hit Grief Hollow, it didn't feel like a rescue, it felt like a reckoning. The melt came in slow surges, first a slow trickle down the rock faces above the timberline, then a thrum beneath the ice that had covered the creek so long it seemed unnatural to hear it run again. Boots no longer froze to cabin floors in the morning. Shovels no longer rang hollow on snow. But with the melting came the tally, and it was steep. 8 children had died that winter. 3 mothers, 4 men, and 1 whole family. 3 bodies frozen in a bed too thin for the cold they'd tried to wade through. Some were buried. Some were left until the soil softened enough to take them. And in every whispered eulogy, between the psalms and the lowering of heads, there hung the silence of one truth. Esther Keen's baby lived. Not just lived, thrived. While children with fathers and full cellars had stiffened in their sleep, Matthew Keen had pink cheeks and a full belly. He could grasp her finger. He could blink against candlelight. And he smiled, truly smiled, before the snow fully left the tree boughs. And that made things worse, because grief turns inward first, then outward, and in a place called Grief Hollow, no man could let sorrow live too long before turning it into blame. And so they blamed her, not for killing, but for proving something they couldn't forgive, that all their work had been wrong. Even the ones who copied her, even those who built thicker walls and double floors, who layered straw and ash beneath their beds, who used felted wool inside their window sashes, resented her in the quiet corners of their minds. They had learned from her, benefited from her, but they did not forgive her for the lesson. And now the questions began. Why hadn't she told them what she knew? Why hadn't she warned them that their cabins would fail? Why hadn't she offered to teach? Never mind that they had laughed at her, spat beside her boot prints, bet coins at the mill on how long she'd last. Now that she had outlasted them, the story had to change, had to shift. In their mouths, It twisted. They told each other she'd held back, let children die rather than share. And it was Jarvis Silas again, the same man who had shoved past her months ago, who stirred it up once more. He stood outside the sawmill one afternoon in early April, wind in his sleeves, eyes sunken and red with a grief that hadn't dulled but hardened. "She let my boys die," he muttered to no one in particular. Knew how to stop it, but let it happen. Others stood around. A few men hammered nails into a fresh wall frame. One sharpened a draw knife, but they heard him. She could have spoken, could have showed us how she built it. Didn't say a word, just sat in her little warm box watching the rest of us freeze. No one argued. That was how it spread, in silence, like frost on wood that looks dry until the first step cracks it. And then came the preacher. He'd arrived before winter, a gaunt man with thin hair and fingers like chicken bones. No family, no past anyone could trace, just a Bible, a cot at the edge of the hollow, and the belief that suffering brought men closer to God. He never smiled, never helped build, just preached, loud and long. But he survived the winter, and now he saw his moment. He called for a gathering on the first clear Sunday. Half the hollow showed up. The chapel was barely more than a barn with a pulpit, drafty, uneven, smelling of old wood and wax. But it filled. Men stood with caps in hand. Women clutched children close. And Esther, though invited, did not come. She didn't need to hear what she already knew. He spoke of suffering, of hardship, of humility, and then he spoke of those among us who refuse to suffer as we do, who hoard wisdom in times of cold, who survive too well when others perish. He never said her name. He didn't have to, and that night 2 men came to her cabin again. Not to accuse, not to shout, just to stand near her door, hoping to glimpse what no one else could explain. She let them. She invited them in. She showed them everything. Opened the floorboards, pulled out the packing, pointed to the seams in the walls, let them run their fingers along the triple panel planks, explained the layering, the ceiling, the shape of the roof, the cloth-stuffed joists, the inward-facing window sills. They sat speechless. When they left, they looked ashamed, not because they now understood, but because they hadn't asked sooner. Word spread again, but differently this time, that she had no secret fuel, no hidden stove, just good design and hard work. And slowly, those who had shunned her began returning, but quietly, and not to praise, just to observe, watch, try to learn what they had missed. And one by one, they began building not just thicker cabins, but humbler ones. Then came the biggest surprise of all. Red Doyle, the trapper who'd once begged to see her floor, began to teach. He traveled from cabin to cabin, not to boast, but to instruct, showed families how to insulate walls with dried cattail heads, how to sew old shirts into windbreaks, how to slope hearths and use ashes to slow radiant loss. He said little, but each time he was asked where he'd learned it, he said only, "The woman up in the hollow." The preacher didn't like that. He preached again, harder, spoke of unnatural comfort, of pride hidden beneath silence, of warmth without God. But fewer listened, because spring had brought the truth with it. And no lie, no sermon-fed fury could bury the reality of what they'd seen. The child was still alive, bright-eyed, strong. And Esther, she didn't gloat, she didn't point fingers, she didn't mock them back. She just started building again. A small addition, not large, no more than a pantry-sized lean-to on the east wall. But she built it with the same quiet hands, the same thick boards, the same layered seams. And that spring, when neighbors came to see it, expecting perhaps a chicken coop or storehouse, she opened the door to show shelves, lined with tools, small ones, cut-down hammers, tiny saws, buckets filled with offcuts and twine. She'd built a workshop, not for herself, for teaching. They stared, speechless. Esther only said, "I won't hold back anymore, but I won't chase you either. If you want to learn how to build a cabin that can keep a child warm through the blackest night, come, I'll show you." And they came, not all, not at once, but slowly. Fathers brought sons, mothers brought daughters, and one by one, under her roof, they began to learn that warmth wasn't just a matter of fire or wood or luck. It was a matter of care, of planning, of love, pressed into every board with a nail tapped soft so it wouldn't split. And the lesson they'd never forget, the one that silenced even the last whispers of resentment, was this. She'd built her cabin not just with extra boards, but with the extra effort no man had believed a woman would spend. Effort meant for someone who couldn't speak, couldn't cry loud enough to wake the dead, couldn't ask for another blanket, a baby. That was the secret. And there had never been anything unnatural about it, just a mother who refused to let the cold decide how the story ended. By the next winter, the baby could crawl. He wasn't fast. His legs still had the softness of a child, not yet hardened by the weight of standing, but his little hands were strong, gripped floorboards with purpose, pulled himself to low shelves. He laughed now too, big, uninhibited, belly-deep sounds that startled birds from the trees when the windows were open and made women pause mid-step outside her cabin, their arms full of chopped wood, just to listen a moment longer. His name was Matthew Jacob Keene, and without knowing it, the boy had become the warmest soul in a place that had known more grave digging than joy. Esther kept her promises. All summer she worked, not just on her own cabin, but with anyone who came. She showed them how to square a seam so tight the wind passed by like a blind dog in the dark. She taught them how to pack insulation like a gut wound, clean, tight, layered and sealed, how to use wax on thread, how to bend rawhide over rafter joints to keep cold from bleeding in, how to bank a hearth with ash so the coals stayed alive till morning without needing a second log. But most importantly, she taught them how to think like someone building for someone else. Don't build for yourself, she'd say. You'll always cut corners. Build like someone smaller than you needs to outlive you in it. And that line, it stayed. People repeated it, scribbled it in ledgers, told it to children. By the end of that summer, there were 3 new cabins built in Grief Hollow, and every one of them had walls that were thicker than pride and floors layered like pastries. They didn't match, they weren't polished, but they held heat, they held breath, they held hope. Still, not everyone changed. There were those who insisted the old ways were good enough, who called the new cabins woman-built or nursery huts, who said winter had simply been cruel the year before and wouldn't return like that again. And for months, the Hollow lived in an uneasy balance, half clinging to the old, half walking toward the new, until the second freeze came. It arrived without warning, mid-October, before the leaves had fully fallen, before the last round of drying meats had even finished curing on their racks. A cold snap so brutal it shattered rainwater before it hit the ground. Chickens froze in their coops. Cattle slipped on ice too thin to see. Trees cracked from the inside like bones breaking under skin. And then it got worse. It didn't leave. For 12 straight days, the sun rose pale and made no heat. For 12 straight nights, the wind howled through the hollow with a sound that felt like it came from beneath the earth rather than above it. Fires burned day and night in every cabin, and still smoke froze in the air like ghosts unable to move on. And then one morning, there was a knock. Esther answered, Matthew on her hip. Outside stood a woman she didn't know well, Calla Sutler, wife to one of the loudest men from the chapel. Her face was swollen with cold, her hands wrapped in raw canvas. In her arms, her daughter, silent, pale, the kind of pale that made your stomach twist. She hasn't spoken in a day, the woman said. Esther opened the door. They stepped inside. She didn't speak, just took the girl, unwrapped her, laid her beside Matthew, and covered them both with a quilt so thick it felt like the weight of the past itself. She stoked the fire. She lit 2 candles, not for light but to bring flame closer to the child's breath. The girl stirred by nightfall, and by morning she whispered a single word, Mama. Esther gave the girl back, but she didn't give back the cold. She held that within her walls. The next day, 3 more knocks, then 5, then 7. Whole families began to arrive, some carrying only children, some with everything they could haul, and Esther let them in, not just into her cabin, but into the work she had started. She walked the men out behind her cabin, where Jacob's old framing wood still lay in a canvas-covered stack, showed them how to build low bunk shelves against her outer wall, how to lay a cloth under boards, how to bank the fire pit so it warmed the stone base of the home itself. She taught even while her arms rocked Matthew, and by the 3rd day something happened no one expected. A man came knocking, not for help, but to offer. He'd brought boards, thick, rough, hand-cut pine, enough for another wall. Esther didn't need it, but she took it, and from those boards she built a second chamber onto her cabin, not large, but sealed, layered, insulated. The first communal room in Grief Hollow, built for no one and everyone at once. That winter, 11 people lived in Esther Keene's cabin. 11 souls, warm every night, and not a single one of them sickened. The preacher said nothing. Jarvis Silas didn't speak either, but he came once, stood outside her door for over an hour, never knocked, then left. Some said they saw tears on his cheeks. Some said he whispered his boys' names. Esther never asked. She kept teaching. The hollow kept changing. And when spring came again, they did something no one expected. They held a gathering, not in the chapel, not at the mill, but outside Esther's cabin. Over 40 people came, not to pray, not to point, but to say something they'd never said before. Thank you. The words didn't come easy, not in a place where pride still held in the bones like old frost, but they said it. And Esther, for the first time in over a year, stood without her son in her arms. She held nothing, and she cried, only once, quietly, but it was enough. Because the valley changed after that. They started building with care, not just speed. They started laying foundations with thought for the child, not just the man. And when strangers came through the hollow in later years, they didn't ask about the mine, or the mill, or the stream. They asked about the widow's cabin, the one with 3 layers of wall, the one where children never caught cold, the one where they taught something no sermon ever had. That warmth is a thing you build with your hands. That strength isn't loud. That sometimes the extra board isn't extra at all. It's the one that saves a life. And Esther Keene, she lived long, saw her son grow tall, saw him leave one day with a woman of his own. But the cabin remained. People still came to learn, still touched the walls with reverence, still whispered stories about the baby who survived the coldest night. And though many details changed over the years, some said she had 5 layers of wall, others said her stove burned coal that never cooled. One thing never changed. They never laughed again. Not at extra boards, not at women who worked alone, not at cabins built for the smallest among them. Because every man in that valley remembered the winter they nearly froze, and how they were saved not by fire, but by the woman who knew how to hold it.